Betsy Thompson. I have Sharon Brown with me. And this is our last lesson in a series of overcoming codependency and other dysfunctional behaviors, a faith and values approach to it. And, you know, it's really not overcoming it. This series was not about overcoming it as much as it was giving you information on codependency and dysfunctional behaviors. And I hope if you've gone through these 9 last lessons with us that you have a better understanding of codependency, adult children issues. I hope that you've gotten better educated about it, and I hope it's helped you in some way. On our last lesson, Sharon, we're going to talk about relapse. Before we get into our lesson, I would like to tell you some of the experiences I've had with teaching these classes. I've had some ladies go through my classes and take the notebooks home with them and work the lessons and do all the things suggested in it and read more and go to support groups and think that it's really working well in their lives. And then all of a sudden they'll call me and they'll say, something's terribly, terribly wrong. It's not working. I'm right back where I started from. I just got back into another bad relationship, just like all the rest. But if you will work the program, it will work, because you won't stay in that bad relationship like you did in the past. You won't be able to, because you will be a different person now, and you will find ways to get out of the relationship and go on and start looking for healthier relationships. But relapse is a normal part of recovery, and it really helps to be aware of it, to be ready for it when it catches us off guard, to not panic quite so much. You're going to panic, but just keep remembering that this is a part of recovery, and believe it, and you can get some good benefits from relapse.
Betsy, how does a person know when they have relapse?
Well, they will usually, like the example I just gave, find themselves in another bad relationship, find themselves involved with caretaking again, deeply involved in someone else's problems that they didn't even have to do, possibly a relapse of their addiction, just doing the same old things again and all the same old feelings flooding back. But it's much different now because they have new information, and it's not as easy to do the things they used to do.
Okay, when they find themselves in that situation, what should they do?
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
When into recovery, we may attain a level of successful emotional functioning, working through the obstacles, conflicts, and then, time and again, march right back to unhappiness and emotional distress. Find ourselves going back to the same old things. Why would we return to the misery and pain we have worked so desperately hard to leave? There are 3 reasons that can contribute to this. One is victimized thinking. Another one is crisis-oriented thinking. And the third one is just part of it is a normal phase of recovery.
Well, what is victim thinking?
Victim thinking comes from the results of being raised in a dysfunctional home. For instance, if you were raised with an abusive parent and you tried to please that parent, you cannot please an abuser. They don't want to be pleased, but they will make you think that they want you to please them. But the harder you try, the more abusive they will become, and they will change the rules. If you do everything perfectly like you want them, like they want it done, they'll change the rules. And there is no way to appease an abusive person. And so if you grew up trying to please a parent that couldn't be pleased, you are a victim, and you will come out of that home feeling like a victim. You may have learned very young that to survive in that kind of environment, you had to take on the role of the victim. You were a little child. This person was older than you and bigger than you and was abusive. So you took on the role of a victim. And we may have learned this from living and associating with people who also learned to survive by being a victim. And so the other family members may have had to do the same thing. So naturally, when you grow up and leave that home environment, you still have the victimized thinking. So when things go wrong in the outside world, we may see this as victimization. And we may see this victimization applying to everywhere and everyone. This is a self-defeating attitude, and it can cause one to take on the role of a victim throughout life. We assume that nothing is going to go right anyway. We have always been victimized. We always will be. And so we live our lives as victims.
Okay, so they start thinking a certain way.
Exactly. They assume everything's going to go wrong, and you know it often does when you have that attitude. We've got to get it in our heads. If we came from a victimized background and we're away from it now, we are not victims anymore. So we've got to learn the new ways of thinking and behaving. We do not need to be victimized anymore. We all have bad days, days when things are not going the way we'd like, days when we have feelings of sadness and fear. But we can deal with our bad days and darker feelings in ways that reflect self-responsibility rather than victimization. We must learn to recognize victimized behavior.
Okay, Betsy, how can we recognize them?
Okay, we're going to talk about that here a little bit later. We must learn how to pull out a victimized behavior to stay in recovery. We're going to learn how to do that.
Okay.
We must learn how to have a good day and enjoy it. Codependents grow up not knowing how to enjoy the good times because they never learned it as a child. Anytime it seemed that things were going good, there was a crisis right around the corner. And that brings on our second thing, which is crisis-oriented thinking. Many of us have lived with people with alcoholic, rageaholic, and other addictive behaviors. People who lived life from one crisis to another, creating crises, being the crisis, controlling our lives with their crises.
Betsy, what is a rageaholic?
A rageaholic is a person that controls the family members by throwing rages, much like an alcoholic throws a drunk. They will go into a rage over something when you least expect it. And again, like with an abuser, if you try to please a rageaholic, it doesn't work because you never know what's going to set the rage off. And it's all done to control. And it is a very dysfunctional way of living, and it's very much like living with an alcoholic. A lot of children who were raised in alcoholic homes, if they don't become an alcoholic, often they will become a rageaholic, and they're using the same behavior that their alcoholic parent used. And so if we were raised in a crisis-oriented home, crisis became a very normal way of life for us. When in recovery, we may find ourselves unable to enjoy the calm and certainty of life. We may feel chronically miserable for no apparent reason, anticipating the return of a miserable state. That is similar to what victimized thinking is. We're just waiting to be victimized again.
It's like we're always thinking negative.
It's a very negative way of thinking. We may have thoughts like this: I love the way things are going, but I know it can't last because it never has. Or I've never been so happy or felt so free, but something's going to go wrong because it always does. Psychologically, now this is so important for us to learn. When we expect something so much, it's going to happen. We will either go out and look for it, or it inevitably finds us. In either case, we return to the misery. Victimized thinking will draw victims to us, will draw people that will make us into victims. Crisis-oriented thinking will draw crisis-oriented people to us.
Okay, so you're saying like it'll draw controllers to us?
It will draw controllers, abusive people, abusers, addicts. In the book Addicted to Misery, Robert Becker says, a working definition of persons who are addicted to misery, and if we're not careful, we can get over all of our addictions and then become addicted to the dysfunctional way of life, or the victimized way of thinking, or the crisis-oriented thinking. Persons who have experienced a chronic and prolonged state of misery or unhappiness and maintained that misery by creating catastrophic expectations about the changes required to stop the addiction, and or who, I'm going to explain this in a minute, once the changes occur, experience significant discomfort with happiness, self-satisfaction, and pleasure, such that they cause either purposeful or directed behaviors to return them to the misery. This is one way that we get into relapse. We are so used to being a victim, or we're so used to living our life from one crisis to another, that when calm and peacefulness and happiness comes our way, we experience misery. It doesn't feel good because we're not used to it. And we haven't attained a level of recovery yet to be able to stay in that peaceful situation.
So it's like fear?
It is the fear of the unknown, fear of new feelings, fear of not knowing what to do with those new feelings. And we will find ourselves seeking out victimized situations and becoming victims again, sometimes without even realizing it, and seeking out crisis-oriented situations. So it takes time, it takes a lot of work, it takes learning about this to change this way of thinking, but it can be done. We may have become so familiar with misery that we begin to feel that misery is normal. We may think that being unhappy and having things go wrong is to be expected. And before you get into a good level of recovery, you're pulled back and forth, you want to get well, but you keep getting pulled back into the misery. But all of a sudden, the misery and the crisis doesn't feel normal like it used to. And yet, the peacefulness doesn't feel normal either, so you're kind of caught in between. And if you'll stay on the road to recovery and you'll keep working the program, eventually you won't be able to stand being in the misery and in the crisis.
Oh, so if you have a relapse, you're going to get out of it.
You will want to get out of it, and you will want to get out of it fast. To get out of being a victim and to get out of crisis-oriented thinking, the belief system that things will never be right for me must be removed. You've got to get out of that way of thinking. You've got to quit believing that. Recovery doesn't begin until that process starts.
Until you remove it.
Till you start telling yourself over and over, things can be right for me. Things will be right for me. And so relapse can be caused by getting into and slipping into victimized thinking. I've always been a victim. It's obvious. I'm always going to be a victim. Or crisis-oriented thinking, where you don't feel normal unless you're in the middle of a crisis. And the other thing that can cause a relapse is we need to understand it is just a normal part of recovery. We're dealing with a lot of issues in recovery. We're changing a lot of old behaviors, a lot of old ways of thinking. That's going to take time, and we're going to do it real well at times. We're going to do it pretty good at times. Sometimes we're not going to do it well at all. Sometimes we're not going to do it at all, and we're going to be in relapse. Sometimes the old feelings creep back in spite of everything.
Okay, is there any reason why these feelings come back?
We can come up with lots of reasons. We can think back and say, well, you know, so-and-so happened, and that triggered it, and that started me on this. And a lot of times we can come up with a reason. Sometimes there's no good reason for the relapse that we can see. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Sometimes the old feelings creep back in spite of everything. We may feel fearful, ashamed, hopeless. We may not feel good enough. The low self-esteem comes back. We may feel unlovable, victimized, helpless, and then, of course, resentful about it all. This is codependency, sometimes described as soul sickness. That's a good description of codependency. You know, we find out in recovery, we never, what you would say, get over codependency. Codependency is what we are. Codependency is what our childhood made us. It's what our past has made us to be. So it's okay to be codependent. We just want to get over the behavior of it. And so it's going to be easy to slip back into it occasionally. Sometimes we slip back in these feelings after we've begun recovery. Sometimes there's a reason. An event may trigger these reactions, such as ending a relationship, stress, problems on the job, or at home or in friendships. Time of change can trigger these reactions, and so can physical illness. You'll notice when you're not feeling well on certain days, you will have the old feelings of codependency, and you'll start thinking, I don't know if all this is going to work or not. I'm not sure about all this. And when you start feeling better, you're ready to start it again. Remember this, a return to the old feelings doesn't mean we're back to square one in our recovery. And even if you think that, and even if you can't get out of that way of thinking, when you get out of the relapse, you'll realize it. You won't be back at square one.
Okay, what can we do when a relapse hit us?
Okay, there are measures to take. Sometimes these feelings that come to us during relapse, we can't give any reason for them to return, but we want to remember a return to the old feelings, as we said, doesn't mean, oh no, I got to start all over again. They do not mean that we have failed at recovery. Relapse is not failure. They don't mean we're in for a long, painful session of feeling badly. They're just there, and we just want to learn to accept it. Now, what can we do when relapse hits? The solution is simple. Practice the basics. Go back, read your books, read through the lessons, do some of the lessons if it feels like you need to. Go back to square one, but you won't be back to square one, and you'll find that out. Start loving and trusting yourself. Detach from the things that are bothering you, from the bad feelings. Deal with the feelings. That just means let yourself feel them, because they're not going to stay. They're going to go away if you let yourself feel them.
Detach, you mean let it go? Okay.
Giving and receiving support from your friends that are in recovery. Try to have some fun during a relapse. Other things you can do are surrender to it. You'll get used to that. You'll start doing that. You'll start...
Surrender to it, you mean give in to it?
Give into it. You'll start saying, oh no, not another relapse. Well, this time I'm not going to fight it. I can't stop it when it hits. There's got to be a reason for it. I may not know what it is, but there's got to be a reason for it. So I'm just going to ride through it. Ride with it, ride it out and through for all it's worth. Throw yourself into it. Say, okay, I'm just going to go with it. Whatever this is all about, I'm just going to go through it and quit resisting it. So much of our anguish is created during a relapse when we're in resistance. So much relief, release, and change are possible when we just accept what's happening to us. Accept the fact that for some reason, I don't know what it is, but for some reason I'm in relapse. Someone will let this work for me. And if nothing else, you've had a real good lesson in acceptance.
Okay, so it's best not to fight it.
It's best not to fight it. You will come out of it much quicker, and you'll get more out of it if you don't fight it.
Okay.
We waste our time, expend our energy, and make things harder by resisting, repressing, and denying. Repressing our thoughts will not make them disappear. Repressing a thought already formed. Remember, we said that a feeling is an emotional energy, an emotional charge. It's already there, so we can't suppress it. And repressing it won't make it disappear. Repressing a thought already formed will not make us a better person. Think it, let it come into reality, and then release it. Because remember, A thought is not forever. If we don't like it, we can think another one or change it. But to do that, we must accept and release the first thought. So we've got to accept the fact that this is relapse. I don't like it. I hate it. I don't see any reason for it. But I'm going to accept it. Resisting events or circumstances in our life does not change things, no matter how undesirable the events or circumstances may be. Acceptance turns us into the person we are and want to be. Acceptance empowers the events and the circumstances to turn around for the better. And so once we accept it, it may make the situation better more than anything else that we could do for the moment. Acceptance and surrender move us forward on this journey. Force does not work.
So you're saying that it takes some time.
It will take time. If we try to force ourselves through a relapse, it won't work. It will probably cause the relapse to last longer. And after you've had a few relapses and realize you can live through them and that they become shorter and less severe, you're going to learn something. That is that more healing and growth will come from periods of pain and periods of relapse than in any other time of your recovery. And so when you learn that, you don't mind it so bad. You don't mind the relapses. You'll begin to think, well, I'm having a relapse, but I'm going to learn a lot of good stuff from it. And when the relapse is gone, I'll be further along on my road to recovery.
Okay, so that can help you get through the situation.
Very much, very much. And that's the last of our lessons. And if any of you have been through these 10 lessons with us, I'd like to ask you to do two things. One of them is get on the road to recovery. And once you've reached a certain level of recovery, take your recovery show on the road, because the rehearsal's over and the show is on. So take it on the road, try it out. You'll fail a few times, you'll have some successes, but try it out. It's the only way you're going to learn. It's the only way you're going to go on to full recovery. And the second thing is take the things you have learned in this series and share it with others. And remember this one important thing. Everything you need for today will be provided because you are not alone. I'd like to share a few things with you, Sharon, as we close. One of the questions that I am most often asked is, after they get into some of this literature and they hear some of it and read some of it, they come up, oh, I don't know about all this. The more you say and the more I read, isn't everybody codependent? I have not really seen an answer to that. I have read several different opinions about it, but my own observation is this. I have seen what you would call reasonably healthy people, and that's somebody that came from a healthy home where they were allowed to express feelings a reasonable amount of the time, where there were no addictions involved, where they had the normal ups and downs of family life. And they came out with a pretty good dose of self-esteem, and they were reasonably healthy and reasonably mature in their adulthood. And I've seen a crisis come into their life and hit them blindsided. And they would go into a tailspin. They would go into panic attack. They would begin to overreact to the crisis. They would make bad judgments. They would not know what to do. They would blame everything and everybody around them for the crisis. And then gradually and slowly they would start to get into reality, and they would start to get some centeredness and balance. And then they'd start to get a hold of themselves and say, now wait a minute. This is what's really happening. Now, what do I need to do about this? And they would start thinking out reasonable ways of coping with the crisis, and they would choose an appropriate answer and solution to it. They might decide, there's nothing I can do about it, I've got to accept it. Or there may be something they can do about it, and before you know it, they're back functioning normal and healthy again.
Okay, so you're saying healthy people, they learn to accept the situation.
Yes, and what you've seen is an example of a non-codependent using codependent ways to get through a crisis. The difference from my observation in a codependent and a non-codependent is what I just described, the non-codependent doing. A codependent lives their whole life like that. They go from one event to another as though it were a crisis. They are in crisis mode all the time. They're overreacting. They're making bad choices. They're not stopping and getting
So
centered.
in their life is always chaos.
They have a life of chaos. And so to say, isn't everybody codependent? I think you could say that anybody is prone to codependent behavior at some time in their life. But a true codependent has lived their whole life like that. And what they can do is learn better ways of coping and healthier ways of behaving. Sharon, have you ever bought a blouse or a shirt that had a tag attached to it, and the tag says, the defects and imperfection in this garment were put there by the process used to make the garment and are done to enhance its appearance? This is how I want it to leave us thinking of ourselves. Everything that's happened in our life, if we will allow it, can enhance what we are. All the defects and everything that's happened to us can be turned around for good for us. And we want to be grateful for our past, because our past has made us what we are. And so if we will work through the things of the past that are hurting us and harming us and let them go, then we can look at them as things that happen to make us a better person. And I'd like to invite you to write for more information on this series to We Are Not Alone, 185 Anthest Drive, Nashville, Tennessee. And thank you for joining us.